Chapter 6 takes Leopold Bloom to the land of the dead, more precisely to Prospect Cemetery in Glasnevin, northwest of the center of Dublin. At 11 a.m., Bloom travels by carriage to the cemetery with several other men to attend the funeral of Paddy Dignam, a man they all knew but evidently never cared much about. So the main theme of the chapter is not the life and death of the man they are burying, but death itself, the final state of every human being who ever lived. Looking back on what we've read so far, we can see that the topic of death has turned up in every one of the first 5 chapters. In chapter 1, Stephen is haunted by the ghost of his newly dead mother. Chapter 2 treats both ancient and modern history as a nightmare of brutality, bloodshed, and corpses. In chapter 3, Stephen watches a live dog confront a dead one, thinks about recovering the body of a drowned man, and again remembers the dying mother that he could not save. In chapter 4, Bloom remembers poor little Rudy, his dead son, and in chapter 5, he ruefully recalls his poor papa who committed suicide. All these references to the dead prepare us for this chapter on death. And this chapter, in turn, makes explicit what has really been implicit up to now. Any work of literature that hopes to represent human life comprehensively must reckon with the point that Mulligan so brutally articulates when he speaks of Stephen's mother as beastly dead. Death is a daily fact of life, as inevitable and inescapable as sunset, chillness, and night. To recognize this inescapable fact is to see why nearly all great epics of Western literature, from Homer's Odyssey to Milton's Paradise Lost, include a trip to the underworld. Now, if we're tracking the parallels between Joyce and Homer, Bloom's visit to the world of the dead at the cemetery comes out of order. In Homer's poem, Ulysses visits the underworld only after he's had many of his experiences, not just a brief visit to the Lotus Eaters. Nevertheless, let's consider what Ulysses finds in the realm of Hades and what it can tell us about Bloom's experience in chapter 6. In Homer's poem, the man who died on Circe's island was called Elpenor, and he died in a rather inglorious fashion. After getting drunk and falling asleep on the roof of Circe's palace, he suddenly jumped up at the sound of his friends talking, stepped off into thin air, and broke his neck. Somehow, Ulysses didn't notice this at the time. He learned about it only after he got to the underworld and talked to the shade of Elpenor, who asked him to go back to Circe's island and bury his body there. In this chapter of Joyce's novel, the counterpart of Elpenor is buried in a cemetery that stands for the underworld, the world of the dead. Officially, Paddy Dignam died of a heart attack. En route to the funeral in the carriage, Martin Cunningham taps his chest and says simply, "Breakdown, heart." But Bloom knows that Dignam drank himself to death rather like Elpenor. "Blazing face," says Bloom to himself. "Red hot. Too much John Barleycorn." Dignam's name is ironic. It recalls the Latin word dignum, meaning worthy, the root of the English words dignity and dignified. But Dignam's death isn't very dignified, and his life, so far as we can tell, was undistinguished. As decent a little man as ever wore a hat, says Mr. Daedalus, but that's about all that is said of him. In the whole of this chapter devoted to the funeral of Paddy Dignam, we hear no eulogy for him. On the other hand, we do meet other characters, living and dead, who recall figures that appear in Homer's Hades. Ulysses in Hades talked to the shade of Agamemnon, the Greek king who was killed by his wife and her lover when he returned from Troy. Likewise, just after Paddy Dignam's coffin is lowered into the ground, Bloom and the other men visit the grave of Charles Stewart Parnell, the great politician who nearly gained home rule for Ireland in 1886 and came to be known as Ireland's uncrowned king. Politically destroyed when newspapers revealed his affair with a married woman, he died a broken man in 1891. So indirectly, you might say that he, like Agamemnon, was ruined by a woman. As Deasy says in chapter 2, a woman too brought Parnell low. Parnell is, of course, now dead, But it's interesting to see that some of the living figures in this chapter also have prototypes among Homer's dead. Homer's Sisyphus was condemned to roll a stone uphill forever. It would roll back and he'd have to push it up once again. He can be recognized in Martin Cunningham, who struggles hopelessly to reform a drunken wife, leading him the life of the damned, Bloom thinks. Wear out the heart of a stone, that. Monday morning, start afresh, shoulder to the wheel. John O'Connell, the cemetery caretaker, recalls Hades, the god of the dead. And Cerberus, the god who guards the entrance to the underworld in classical literature generally, reappears as the dog-like Father Coffey, the celebrant of the funeral service. Simon Dedalus says he has a belly like a poisoned pup. Besides evoking some of the figures who populate the world of Homer's Hades, this chapter also recreates the action of the Hades episode. It tells the story of a journey to the land of the dead. To reach this land in Homer's epic, Ulysses sails northwest to the fog-bound land of the Cimmerians, where he digs a pit, sacrifices sheep, lets their blood run into the pit, and thus draws the shades of Hades, the spirits of the dead who desperately want to talk to him. In chapter 6 of Joyce's Ulysses, the funeral procession travels in the same direction as Ulysses did. It starts at Sandymount, southeast of the center of Dublin, and moves northwest to reach the cemetery in Glasnevin. En route to the cemetery, the procession passes a stretch of ripped-up roadway that seems to open up an underworld. It passes cattle being led to slaughter, like the sheep sacrificed in Homer's Hades. The mourners cross 2 canals and 2 rivers that together recall the 4 rivers of Hades. And just before the gates of the cemetery, they pass a stone-cutter's yard, where a congregation of statues vividly suggests the shades of Homer's Hades yearning for Ulysses. Crowded on the spit of land, silent shapes appeared, white, sorrowful, holding out calm hands, knelt in grief, pointing in white silence, appealing. So in many ways, the movement of the funeral procession and the experience of the mourners in this chapter reenact the experience of Ulysses in Homer's epic. Most importantly, the movement of the mourners, and of Bloom in particular, reenacts an experience that Ulysses survives. Ulysses visits the world of the dead, but after talking to a number of its inhabitants, he leaves and returns to his ship, returns to the world of the living. Likewise, Bloom ends up his visit to the cemetery by walking out through the cemetery gates back to the world of the living again. When Bloom comes back through those gates at the end of the chapter, he silently rejoices at the renewal of life. There is another world after death named hell, he thinks. And then he realizes that Martha Clifford's typo actually makes sense for him now. I do not like that other world, she wrote. No more do I, says Bloom to himself. Plenty to see and hear and feel yet. Feel live, warm beings near you. Let them sleep in their maggoty beds. They are not going to get me this innings. Warm beds, warm, full-blooded life. Bloom's vital thoughts and feelings here epitomize the complex point of the chapter as a whole, which actually reverses what you might expect. You would expect a chapter on burial to be a kind of memento mori, a reminder that death lies waiting for us all. And we are indeed repeatedly reminded of death in this chapter. When the funeral procession passes the tiny coffin of a child en route to burial, Martin Cunningham solemnly observes, "In the midst of life." He's quoting from an old saying that appears in the burial service of the Book of Common Prayer. In the midst of life, we are in death. But thanks to the indestructible vitality of Leopold Bloom, the basic message of this chapter is finally just the opposite. In the midst of death, we are in life. This is what Bloom says to himself when he thinks about the fascinating oddity of lovemaking among the tombstones, and the fact that the caretaker of the cemetery, John O'Connell, has managed to beget 8 children here. Bloom's mind is the psychic center of this chapter, and Bloom's mind is fundamentally life-affirming. We see this first in his response to the sight of Stephen Dedalus, who briefly appears near the beginning of the chapter. At 11 o'clock, you remember, Stephen was heading for Sandymount Strand, the beach where he meditates on life, death, and transformation. On his way to the beach, Stephen catches the eye of Leopold Bloom, who is riding in the funeral carriage en route to the cemetery, and who, it is clear, already knows Stephen well enough to recognize him. It's only a one-way sighting. Stephen gives no look back, much less saying anything. But this is the first time that his path crosses Bloom's. And this momentary crossing of their paths prefigures their later convergence. Significantly, Stephen is not noticed by his own father, Simon, for there is a gulf between the two. Stephen is sighted only by Bloom, who reports the sighting to Simon. And when Simon learns that they've just passed Stephen, he simply flies into a rage against Mulligan, a contaminated, bloody, double-dyed ruffian bent on ruining Stephen, or so Simon says. Now, we've seen enough of Mulligan to feel the force of Simon's charge against him, but Bloom's thoughts take him in a quite different direction. Noisy, self-willed man, Bloom thinks, full of his son. He is right. Something to hand on. If little Rudy had lived, see him grow up, hear his voice in the house, walking beside Molly in an Eton suit. My son, me in his eyes. Strange feeling it would be. From me, just a chance. Bloom's thoughts slide from the living son, Stephen, to the dead son, Rudy, and then to the son that Rudy could have been now, at age 10, all dressed up like an English schoolboy in an English Eton suit. We might guess from this passage that Bloom is already beginning unconsciously to think of Stephen as his surrogate son, a replacement for the son he has lost. And later on, as we'll see, Bloom will virtually try to adopt Stephen. But for now, Bloom thinks about Rudy. And what's remarkable about his thoughts here is that they revolve not around the death of this infant boy, but around his life, and specifically the moment of his conception. Must have been, Bloom thinks, must have been that morning in Raymond Terrace she was at the window watching. Two dogs at it, and the sergeant grinning up. She had that cream gown on with the rip she never stitched. Give us a touch, Poldy. God, I'm dying for it. How life begins. This is a startling passage, to say the least. One critic of Joyce, a critic named Darcy O'Brien, charges that Bloom is unconsciously beating up on himself here. In Bloom's mind, says O'Brien, Rudy's conception had nothing to do with Bloom's own sexual attraction or with Molly's love for him. Instead, two dogs at it and the grin of a sergeant set Marion Bloom in motion. The incident, I'm quoting O'Brien here, the incident is a typically Joycean view of the sexual act, bestial and obscene. Bloom's dwelling with evident pleasure on Rudy's bizarre conception compromises the pity one feels for him as a grieving father. End quote. So says O'Brien. But I have to say that I think he's all wet. In my judgment, he misses the point of the passage, misunderstands Bloom, and misunderstands Joyce. To be human, as Bloom resoundingly is to be profoundly conscious that we are embodied, that we are creatures of flesh and blood and instinct, as well as of mind and spirit and morality. In Bloom's mind, the fact that we have animal appetites for such things as food and sex does not make us bestial. These appetites are inescapably part of what makes us human. And to deny them is to deny a fundamental part of ourselves. Why, he might ask, why should we be ashamed to copulate in something like the way animals do? Why can we not admit that even within marriage, a perfectly healthy desire for sex may sometimes be sparked by hormones alone, rather than by such lofty motives as love and admiration? If we always had to wait for the latter, how long would the human race last? In my view, Bloom is not self-deprecating here. He's frankly and unsqueamishly facing the fact that conception may spring from something totally unexpected, a sudden, irresistible stirring in the loins. Give us a touch, Poldy. God, I'm dying for it. How life begins. How life begins. That's the bottom line of this passage, literally. Bloom does not brood over Rudy's death. He celebrates in recollection the wonder of Rudy's birth. And even as he rides to a burial, he mentally recreates a moment in which Molly's dying, her dying for sex, made life begin. And though that life was doomed to end in just 11 days, Bloom still has a living teenage daughter bursting with life as he goes on to reflect. He knows, as we have seen, that she may soon have sex herself with a young student, her young student admirer. Right? But for Bloom, that is just one more sign of her vitality. Millie, Bloom thinks, her tomboy oaths, "Oh, jumping Jupiter, ye gods and little fishes." Still, she's a dear girl, soon be a woman. Mullingar, dearest Papley, young student. Yes, yes, a woman too. Life, life. Though Bloom's commitment to life perseveres throughout this chapter, he must sometimes struggle to keep it up. He must endure not just repeated reminders of death, but also painful reminders of what Molly is planning back home. As the funeral procession passes a restaurant, one of the other men in the carriage catches sight of Blazes Boylan, who flashes his straw hat in greeting. Bloom looks down to study his fingernails, while silently wondering what Molly can see in this flashy, self-promoting bill sticker. And as Bloom studies his nails, we may recall that in chapter 5 he thought about the nails used in the crucifixion of Christ. Iron nails ran in. Once again, Bloom feels something like those nails running into him when he is asked about Molly's concert tour. For in spite of the men's politeness, he cannot think about the tour without thinking of Boylan, even if Boylan had not just been spotted. Still more painful for Bloom is the memory of his father's suicide, a memory provoked by what the others say, but that he cannot share with them. Much of the time, Bloom is mentally isolated from the others, even as he sits in the carriage and talks to them. Speaking of Paddy Dignam, a man named Power says he had a sudden death, to which Bloom says, the best death. And when he gets only wide open stares, he goes on to explain, no suffering. A moment and all is over, like dying in sleep. To this, no one speaks. Bloom's view of dying is practical, rational, and humane, but it gets no credit because it leaves no room for the dying man to make a last confession, to prepare his soul for death, which is what Christian tradition requires. As if to punish Bloom for his ignorance of this point, Mr. Power goes on to say, thoughtlessly, but worst of all is the man who takes his own life. Martin Cunningham tries to blunt the edge of this remark because he knows about Bloom's father. Temporary insanity, of course, he says. We must take a charitable view of it. Silently, Bloom appreciates these sympathetic words, but Cunningham looks away from Bloom right after he speaks them, leaving Bloom alone with his pain. Thinking of suicide without mentioning the word, Bloom says to himself, they have no mercy on that here, or infanticide. Refuse Christian burial. They used to drive a stake of wood through his heart in the grave, as if it wasn't broken already. Unlike Christians such as Mr. Power, Bloom feels nothing but pity for the suicidal father. But notice what he says here. They, Christians, have no mercy on suicide or infanticide. To see why infanticide should come to his mind here, we must remember that the funeral carriage has just passed a team of horses drawing a tiny coffin, the coffin of a child. Noting this, Bloom thinks immediately of Rudy as he tries to imagine the little corpse inside the coffin. A dwarf's face, mauve and wrinkled like little Rudy's was. Mistake of nature. If it's healthy, it's from the mother. If not, from the man. Better luck next time. According to Don Gifford, what runs through Bloom's head at this point is the ancient Jewish belief that the health of a child reflects the virility of its father, and that would make Bloom responsible for Rudy's fatal sickness. Since Bloom is hardly an Orthodox Jew, I don't know whether or not he accepts this ancient belief. But almost immediately after thinking about it, he thinks about infanticide. Why? Why should he think of infanticide just now? Could it be that he sees himself as the murderer of little Rudy? If so, that might help us to see why he has had no complete sexual intercourse with Molly since Rudy's death. It might help us to see why he cannot bear to even try to have another child. We'll pursue this idea further as we work our way through the book. For now, we can see that Bloom is doubly isolated from the other men attending this funeral. Even as they briefly discuss the death of a man that none of them cares much about, Bloom is silently pained by the memory of two deaths that he cannot bear to mention aloud, the death of his father and the death of his little son. Secondly, he's isolated from the others by an identity that remains racially Jewish, however unorthodox he is, and that others see as Jewish, definitely not Christian. No matter how hard Bloom tries to be one of the boys, or rather one of the goys, one of the Gentiles, he fails. Consider what happens when the men in the funeral carriage catch sight of an old Jewish moneylender named Reuben J. Dodd stumping along and bent over a walking stick. Simon Dedalus, who owes him money, says mildly, "The devil break the hasp of your back." Martin Cunningham says, "We have all been there," meaning they have all been to Dodd for a loan. But then, catching Bloom's eyes, he corrects himself. Well, nearly all of us. Even Cunningham, sympathetic though he is, leaves Bloom out. Thus excluded, Bloom hastily tries to get back in by telling a funny story about the Jewish moneylender. Dodd and his son were riding a boat one day down the River Liffey, and the son suddenly threw himself in. When the boatman fished him out, Reuben J. gave the man a florin, about $12 in today's money, for saving his son's life. In telling this story on Dodd, Bloom clearly wants to show that he himself has nothing to do with the stereotypical miserliness of anti-Semitic legend, that he can laugh at it just as well as any goy can. But Bloom never gets to tell the whole story and collect the reward of laughter because Cunningham jumps right into the middle of it and steals his punchline. This is just one of the many slights that Bloom must suffer in the course of the day, one of many reminders that he is not and never will be fully a part of this Gentile society, no matter how hard he tries. Let me give you one more example of how he is made to feel his exclusion. Just before the coffin is lowered into the ground, Bloom sees a newspaperman named Hines who is writing something in a notebook, evidently taking the names of all those attending the funeral. Since Hines and Bloom work for the same newspaper, and since Hines owes Bloom a little money, as we learn later, Bloom quite reasonably expects that Hines has no need to ask him who he is. But Hines does ask, and his question is a masterpiece of stupidity. "What is your Christian name?" he asks. And after learning that the name is Leopold, Hines still gets the full name wrong. It later appears in the newspaper as L. Boom. Bloom's distance from the others, his mental isolation from them, his sense of difference from them, is nowhere more evident than in his silent comments on what is absolutely essential to Christian burial, the doctrine of the resurrection, the belief that Christians who die will one day rise again and go to heaven, as Christ did after his death. As the mourners follow the coffin from the chapel to the gravesite, Bloom falls into step with a commercial traveler named Kernan. As the only other non-Catholic in the group, Kernan may feel some connection with Bloom. But as a Christian, Kernan quotes the crucial words of the Christian burial service: "I am the resurrection and the life." That touches a man's inmost heart, says Kernan. And then Bloom silently answers him, "Your heart, perhaps. But what writes the fellow in the 6 feet by 2 with his toes to the daisies? No touching that. Seat of the affections, broken heart, a pump after all, pumping thousands of gallons of blood every day. One fine day it gets bunged up and there you are. Lots of them lying around here, lungs, hearts, livers, old rusty pumps, damn the thing else. The resurrection and the life. Once you are dead, you are dead. Come forth, Lazarus." And he came 5th and lost the job. Bloom is playful, irreverent, and irredeemably pragmatic. For him, the human body is not the temple of the Holy Ghost, not the halfway house of a spirit made to live forever in heavenly bliss, but is rather a mechanical apparatus, fated to break down one day like an old, rusty pump. Once you are dead, you are dead. But Bloom's take on death is wonderfully paradoxical. For even as he rejects the Christian belief in an afterlife, he affirms his own belief in the indestructibility of this life. Looking around the cemetery, Bloom thinks about the fertilizing power of corpses. It's the blood, he tells himself. It's the blood sinking in the earth gives new life. Bloom simply cannot believe that death ends life. Whatever becomes of the soul, he thinks, the body lives forever, changing form, invigorating the earth, breeding flowers, but never dying. Near the end of this chapter, Bloom's mind breeds wild thoughts about life in the midst of death. As the gravediggers throw clods of earth on the lowered coffin, Bloom wonders, and if he was alive all the time? Phew! By jingo, that would be awful. They ought to have some law to pierce the heart and make sure, or an electric clock, or a telephone in the coffin, and some kind of canvas, air hole, flag of distress. Bloom can't bear the thought, the idea that life might be prematurely suffocated, and he casts about for the most up-to-date ways of sustaining it, or at the very least commemorating it. Have a gramophone, he thinks, in every grave, or keep it in the house. After dinner on a Sunday, put on old great-grandfather, crack, hello, awfully glad, crack, awfully glad again, hello, remind you of the voice like the photograph remind you of the face. Bloom knows the value of the latest inventions. He's already a man of the 20th century, looking forward as well as back. If his idea of putting a telephone in the coffin sounds comically useless, and if great-grandfather's voice on the gramophone sounds like that of a drunken parrot, Bloom nonetheless sees that even in 1904, we already had the means to preserve the human voice, to keep it alive on the gramophone, the ancestor of the videotape or audio tape on which you're even now hearing this lecture. Just after Bloom imagines the sound of a voice on the gramophone, his own ear is caught by the sound of a much more primitive form of life, a fat old rat scampering along the pebbles beside a stone crypt. As Bloom watches, we read, the gray alive crushed itself in under the plinth, wriggled itself in under it. Good hiding place for treasure. Bloom is fascinated and even delighted by things that often repel other people. The tang of urine in a mutton kidney, the decomposition of a corpse, the wriggling of a fat old rat under a block of stone. For Bloom, all of these things are signs of life. And throughout this chapter, as we have seen, Bloom repeatedly affirms his faith in life against everything that conspires to kill it physically and psychologically. Silently, Bloom endures all the pains and sorrows that might kill the spirit of a lesser man. The sight of his wife's lover, the memory of his father's suicide, the memory of little Rudy's death, the thought that he himself might have caused that death, the consciousness of an inescapably Jewish identity that separates him from these Irish Catholic mourners and that will forever keep him from becoming one of the boys, one of the goys. Bloom bears all of these burdens with what might be called heroic, even Ulyssian fortitude. Ironically, this father of a dead son is far more life-affirming than Simon Dedalus, the father of a live one. Early on in the chapter, Bloom notices Stephen and thinks of his potential, something to hand on. Simon fails to notice Stephen, says nothing good about him when Bloom points him out, and ends up in this chapter weeping over the grave of his wife, Stephen's mother, begging God to take him whenever he likes. Simon wants to die. Bloom wants to live. Walking out through the cemetery gates at the end of the chapter, he returns to life just as Ulysses did in Homer's epic after his sojourn in the world of the dead. Listen again to Bloom's thoughts on this point as he remembers the letter from Martha. I do not like that other world, she wrote. No more do I. Plenty to see and hear and feel yet. Feel live, warm beings near you. Let them sleep in their maggoty beds. They are not going to get me this innings. Warm beds, warm, full-blooded life.